Well, that was fucked.
And today, we're going to be talking about why high rep work is very important for strength training. I think all of us have heard that 12 to 8 reps is great for hypertrophy. Anything down to like 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is great for strength training. But today we're going to talk about why those higher rep ranges are really important. If you've run any of the Sika strength training programs, you'll have started off with your sets of 10, maybe even sets of 12 on some squats. You'll have done those for the initial kind of 4 weeks of training, and you'll have prepped yourself very well for that block before getting down into those lower reps and heavier weight. Why do we do that? Well, there's 5 or 6 reasons we do it. The first reason is to build work capacity. So commonly when we think about strength training, we don't really think about work capacity. We rarely think about becoming fitter in order to do better training. This is highly important. If we understand that there is a certain amount of volume we have to do at a requisite intensity or weight to make progress, to bring it from a 200 kilo squat to a 220 kilo squat, it's very important we can do that volume effectively and do multiple sets of that volume. So when we're starting off a block, we start with very high reps. It's very likely we'll even cut down those rest periods in between, and we'll force people to be out of breath. We'll make sure their aerobic system is making some adaptations and making them aerobically fitter so they can do better working sets at those heavier weights later on. This work capacity doesn't just stop at aerobic work capacity. So obviously there's anaerobic work capacity as well. The ability of our muscle tissues to non-aerobically produce energy and ensure that when we get to something like a very heavy 3x3, we're not going to be massively bathed in a bath of lactic acid. So it's important that our muscle tissues are prepared and able to flush out those waste products, to take those harmful products away from the muscle tissues themselves and allow us to continue training effectively. This isn't only important during the set itself. I think we've all been in the experience where we're doing a set of 10, by the time we get to maybe 7, 8 and 9 of those reps, we're already starting to feel a bit of a burning in our quads or maybe in our glutes. Then when we get to our 10th rep, we can really feel it burning. But the very important aspect for this, and why we really want to bring it into our training programs, is to make sure we can effectively wash those out in between sets. So rather than inter-set recovery, it will be intra-set recovery. How we're recovering in between set 1 and set 2 and set 3, and so on. The next aspect of why we want higher rep training at the start of our block is it's very important that the start point of a training block is achievable. You can't get on the ladder if you can't reach the first step. The aspect of this that we have to contend with is that thousands of athletes run these training programs, and so we have to make sure the first rung of that ladder is quite low. This usually looks around 55% to 65% of 1 rep maximum, and if we bring somebody in and ask them to do 5 sets of 3 at 55%, they'll get almost nothing from that training session. So how do we then bring that lower barrier for entry and make it a small bit more difficult? Well, we ensure the weights stay low, but we then jack up the work volume. So make them work a small bit harder in those sessions, make them push themselves a small bit more, but in a slightly different direction. The other thing with making this barrier for entry a bit more achievable, and the kind of back end of this, is that many of the powerlifters and strength training athletes who come to us have rarely done a lot of high rep work. For this reason, we see a lot of people struggling. First 4 weeks of training programs, oftentimes, they'll find that the most difficult part of the training program, and then once they're into week 4 through 8 or 4 through 10, they absolutely fly through the rest of the block. So it is one of these cases where obviously the 1 rep max number is important when we start a training block. The percentage or relative percentage of that 1 rep max number is absolutely vital when you're planning your training. But in order to make those sessions valuable and to make sure your athlete or you yourself are getting something out of them, doing some higher rep work there is a great way of getting valuable work done while also making sure everybody's going to be able to start on day 1 of week 1. Number 3 then is that it allows for a lot of technical practice. And this, to be honest, is probably one of my favorite things, or one of the prime points here for having a lot of high rep work in there. High rep work and its association with skill practice. I know a lot of you are going to immediately cast your eyes to something like high rep metcons in CrossFit, where you see some form breaking down. This isn't what we're talking about here. We're talking about getting 50 reps of high quality, really good movement done in a 5 set of 10 training session versus getting 20 reps done in a 4x5 training session. And this is what we're talking about. At the start of blocks, the relative intensity is always quite low, as we spoke about earlier, and so we're always able to get slightly better technical positions achieved. But we need to get a lot of that work done to ensure those motor patterns are very well ingrained. So it's not so much something where I'm going to achieve perfect positions after 2 or 3 sessions and then those perfect positions will stay there forever. Everybody knows that a lot of practice is going to be absolutely vital to really solidifying those motor patterns and becoming comfortable with them. The other aspect of this, outside of motor patterns and outside of that neurocognitive side of things, is that if you're making some technical changes or physiological changes to be able to hit those positions in the first place. So let's say you want to go to a deeper squat and you're working on your ankle and hip mobility. Maybe you're working on a more upright torso, so you're utilizing your legs more and you're working on more quad development. If you're in this case and you're making these physiological changes to then make a technical change further down the road, it's very important we have a massive amount of reps done so we can utilize those physiological changes. I think we've all come to the position where maybe we start the session off and our shoulders are quite tight and we can't achieve that perfect position we want overhead, or maybe our ankles are quite tight and our hips sit back quite a lot in our squat. Maybe we go and work on that for 10 or 15 minutes in a mobility piece at the start of a session. We then start achieving those better positions. We might get up to 75 or 80% of our working sets for the day, and then suddenly we start getting into our working sets, or maybe we start getting towards the end of our final working sets and we get a degradation back to original position. The best way to make sure we don't start just suddenly falling back to these secondary positions and degrading back to that poorer form is by doing a hell of a lot of practice and putting a massive amount of bullets down the barrel of that rifle to make sure you are as well refined as possible. Number 4 then is that it allows for the classic X model of periodization, or X model of progression. So generally speaking, when we start the training block off, we start with very high volume, we start with very low intensity. Over the course of that block, that intensity increases, that volume decreases, and we get this X pattern for our progression. If I was to start off and I suddenly don't start with that high volume and I start off with slightly lower volume, and maybe I start with, rather than low intensity, slightly higher intensity, then that X isn't quite as severe. And what you start noticing is you just can't make that same level of progress from week to week because the slope of those lines in that X pattern aren't quite as severe. I'm going to make a quite clear and obvious example of this for you. On Tuesday of this week, you're supposed to do 4 sets of 8 reps on the squat, and you're supposed to do it at 60% of 1RM. If I know I want to go and do squats again on Friday of this week, I'm not going to do 4 sets of 8 reps at now 70% of 1RM. We probably know a 10% jump from week to week, starts with training block, might be a bit too much. So now what am I going to do? Well, if I know I want to get to 70%, and I know I want that slope of the line to be somewhat constant in the intensity realm of things, so I want to go from 60% to 70% to 80%, well, what am I going to do now? I'm going to adjust the slope of the volume line. So rather than doing 4 by 8, on the Friday again, maybe I'll do 4 by 6. So slightly less volume, just making that session a small bit easier in terms of the total work we have to do, but it will also ensure that that progression stays constant. This is clear and obvious in the case of going from 4 by 8 to 4 by 6. I think everyone could understand that, but when we start getting into the weeds of it, and more importantly, when we start pulling this out over a prolonged working period, it's very important that the start of those blocks have very defined high volume, low intensity, and the end of the block has very defined high intensity and low volume. We don't have to explain this part to anyone. Everybody wants to go for a 1 rep max at the end of a training block, but usually we just have to make this a small bit more clear. Now finally, why we like doing high rep work is that when we start getting into those higher rep ranges, we start seeing some of those errors popping up, maybe those rarer errors that we'd usually only see at very high percentage of 1 rep max. Usually we can bring in fatigue and start inducing some of those errors with 50% that usually we'd only see at 95, 97 and 100% of 1 rep max otherwise. So this is a very, very good training tool to start eking out and start really flossing out some of those issues someone might have or you yourself might have and start practicing on them. A very good example of this is somebody whose bracing or pattern of bracing might start breaking down when they're quite fatigued. Bracing is the homogeneous solidifying of our midline. It's really making sure all of our core musculature is working as hard as possible to put us in as ideal a position as possible throughout the entire rep. So let's take a squat, for example. Most people will breathe out maybe against their belt, or they'll breathe out and brace their anterior core. They'll start squeezing their posterior and midline then. When this happens, at the start of a rep, people are usually very, very well braced. They'll usually start sitting down, and then sometimes at around parallel, we'll see people losing that heavily braced position. They'll loosen up slightly to eke some of that bottom position out, to get a small bit deeper, to allow their hips to relax a bit more, maybe to utilize that stretch shortening cycle a bit more. Until we start getting to heavier weights, we rarely see this as a degradation in position, because usually the weight on the barbell isn't sufficiently heavy enough to push the person out of position. So they can start loosening up and really bouncing out of the bottom position at squat quite easily. But because that weight isn't sufficiently heavy, their midline can kind of hold it with 75% of the effort that they should have been putting in to the bracing. What happens in those higher end rep ranges is when that person now becomes fatigued and they're doing 75% of that relative effort, well, it's probably 75% of an already massively taxed 100% of bracing, and so maybe we only actually have 50% bracing going on here. We only have 50% of that total muscle system working, and now we start getting degradation in those positions like what we would see at those exceedingly heavy weights. As a coach, this allows you to make sure somebody is really actively cued to make sure they're maintaining positions. As an athlete, this can allow you, it can be like a litmus test to see, are you really bracing? Is this really what you've been working on? Has all of that accessory work been working quite well? So I hope this video has been useful to you. If you have questions like this, please drop them down in the comments below. As always, this video is brought to you by the Sika Strength app. If you want a bigger and stronger and more resilient upper body, I would highly recommend the brand new program that's just come onto the Sika Strength app, and that is Sika Strength Upper Body Body Armor. So this is all of your upper back, shoulders, arms, midline work you're going to need, specifically written to help you fend off some of those more niggly blows that might otherwise put you out of training for a few weeks. So getting a bigger, stronger, more resilient upper body is certainly going to be useful, and it's certainly more fun to be more jacked in the upper body. That's available on iOS and Android. You can try it on a 7-day free trial.